So, your figures are stiff like a piece of wood. Well, fortunately, there are just a couple of reasons why that might be, and today that's what I want to talk about, starting with reference, because if you cannot draw from reference, you probably cannot draw figures from imagination either. So, the most common issue that I've seen is actually picking a bad reference. If you take something like this, you might have gone through Pinterest and you might have written something like, oh, dynamic pose or sports poses and whatnot. And you find something like this, even something like this. And you might think, well, these are supposed to be dynamic poses. What's wrong with them? Oh, this is cool. Look, it's got a sword. Maybe your query was pose with a sword. Well, the problem is these are not completely unusable. But if you are a beginner, if your figures are already stiff, you do not have the tools to interpret something like this. Because when you look at this and you try to apply, let's say, the stick mannequin gesture, then you're going to do this. And this. And this. And then maybe you draw the sword. So you see the problem here. This reference does not give us enough information about the pose to make it look dynamic. We want to choose something that's easy enough to interpret and understand so that it makes our life easier when studying. What about this? What's the problem with this? Clothing. You probably won't understand how, even if you know the CSI gesture lines, how do you know how to apply them here? So you're probably going to do something like this. And this is what I've seen happen a few times. You do this, and then you do this, and then you see, oh, this is the orientation of the hips. This is the leg. This is the other leg. And this, well, probably something like that. Let's do this. This is basically straight, so let's do so. So you see, this is not a good gesture because it doesn't consider the actual movement of the pose. It's very difficult to interpret. Do not use this type of reference. Do not use this. And do not use this one because even if it is technically a dynamic pose, this guy's running, you can't see anything. What are you going to do here? It's a front-facing pose, so everything is on one line. The best you can do is this. I would honestly not use this reference myself, even though I can extract some of the landmarks. Using something like this is like shooting yourself in the foot before you even start. So don't do that. But okay, let's say you pick good references or better references. What about something like this? This is already better. It's somewhat dynamic. It's got shifted weight. It's on this leg. So you might think, okay, I'm gonna use that as a reference. So let's see what a beginner might do. So let's apply the simple stick mannequin again. And then we do this again. Oh, this leg is straight. And then we have the foot here. We have this foot here. And then we have this arm. Maybe you can bend the arm a little bit. And then we have the hand. And then what do we do here? Well, the arm is bent, so I'm going to do this. So you see, the problem is still, even with a slightly better reference, that the interpretation in most cases, and I got a few examples from my students here, the interpretation uses very straight lines. So we can't do that. What we have to do is emphasize the reference or pick something that's even more dynamic. What about something like this? This is actually a very good starting point as a beginner reference because most of the curves are already solved for us. So if you were to tackle something like this, you might still make the neck pretty stiff. You might still make the shoulders pretty stiff. But then when you compare these 2 points, the crotch and the pit of the neck, let's say it's something like this, you see that there is a line that's curved in between. So you're naturally drawn to something like that. You see that there is a steep angle here. And so what you're going to do, even if you straighten up the leg there, is this. So already, even though this interpretation has flaws, let's say I've exaggerated there, something like this, because the reference is very forgiving, this already starts looking a little more interesting. But as I said, it's still got issues. Using a lot of straights, not a good idea. We got C, S, I, lines that we can use for reference, and we gotta use them all. So what do? We bend beyond the point of breaking it. We try to express this pose in the most dynamic way we possibly can. How would we handle something like this pose instead of using the stiff mannequin? One of the first things you want to look out for is angles. A lot of the issues come from misinterpreting angles. If I actually quickly show you an example here. This is from one of my students, and you can tell it's from this one pose here. The problem is all these angles have been severely misinterpreted, so much so that even if the pose is fairly balanced, it tends to lean backwards. So pay attention to the angles, to all of the angles and the various points of the pose. Let's say we start with the head. We want to get the tilt of the head. The head is tilted like that. Then we don't want to use a straight line for the neck. We use a curve because the neck goes inside here. So we use a curve. We're going to use a stick mannequin with just one line now because it's the easiest, but you can absolutely apply that to a different type of mannequin, like for example the Watts method that has more than a single line. We check the angle of the shoulders and we draw that. What is the distance between here and here? What happens? Well, something like this probably. Proportions are important, but not as much. There are a few things that you can mess up proportion-wise that are going to make the pose stiffer, but we're going to see that later. So what are we going to do here with this somewhat confusing torso pose? Well, we had done the straight line here, but you can see it's very stiff. So instead, I'm going to opt for an S-curve here. So I'm going to start here at the top and then proceed with the next S-curve. Noting where the crotch is. You can see if I draw a plumb line, it's actually on the side of the head, much more than I had done before. And this is another common issue. The pose becomes narrower and stiffer because these distances are not considered. So I want to exaggerate. Why don't I exaggerate it even a little more than it should be? So let's increase the space here, make it even more dynamic. Let's do something like that with an S-curve. Not excessive because it's still a very gentle pose. It's not extreme, but something like that might help. What about the legs? One of them bears the weight, the other doesn't. When one of the legs bears the weight, you can make it straight if there is weight pushing. We're going to see it with that pose. But for this one, I want to see the natural curving lines of the body. Look at what happens here. The tibia specifically has this kind of reverse C-curve. We want to take these into account at all times. When designing a pose, even though the bone is technically straight, you cannot do this. If you do this, the pose is going to be completely stiff. And the stiffer it is at the beginning, in terms of gesture, the stiffer it's going to be later when you add volumes on top. So as a very baseline starting point, you want the gesture to be very dynamic. So I want to emphasize this. Even if I know that the foot is roughly where the head is there, I am going to consider the leaning and then do a slight curve there, trying to overshoot and then go back. Like so. I'm going pretty slow now. I'm going to show you how to do it a little faster by flicking the pen or pencil, because that's another one of the issues that might come up. The other side, I can actually use a single line there. So I'm going to see this gesture there and just go down like that. Here for the arm, I want to consider this S-curve created by the deltoid. So I'm going to do that. And then for the other part, I'm actually going to keep it straight. Something like so. For the other, I know that technically speaking, the bone here, the humerus, is straight, but I am going to curve it because I see that this is the gesture that happens there. So I'm going to curve this a little. I'm going to figure out, I don't care where it ends, I'm going to figure out where the elbow is, and then I'm going to flick the other. So this would be a much better interpretation of the same reference instead of this. I guess you can compare the two. So what I mentioned about flicking is basically doing this sort of motion when you're drawing the lines instead of stopping exactly where it should. I've seen a lot of people that try to take even dynamic poses like this one, like I've done here, and start and stop, start and stop. This is not how you want to handle gesture. Gestures are, well, gestural. So what you want to do is something like that. And then this would be the elbow. I don't care exactly where that ends. I don't care how or where this ends. I'm just gonna flick it. So if I go over this one specifically in the way that I would approach it, I'll draw the head. Then I would figure out how I want to orient the neck. In fact, I'm probably going to orient it the other way. I'm going to understand where my shoulders are. I don't care if the head is small at this stage. I really don't. But I want to know where the pit of the neck is compared to the crotch. It's something like this here. Now, the important part is not really just the distance, which, again, we can emphasize. We can push here. Is the gesture that happens between the 2 points. So this we already have. Very convenient, something like this. And you can see I don't just stop there. I just flick it. It's flicking the pen, stylus, or pencil, whatever you're using. Then I figure my angle there. What's the distance between this point and this point? Let's say it's somewhere here. Doesn't really matter that much. And then I could use a straight again for this leg here because it's bearing the weight, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go down and then do this because I want to emphasize. You can see it here. It's kind of like an S curve. So I emphasize that. I make sure I mark. I didn't do it here, but consider as if I did. I mark where the ground plane is. I want to make sure I know that this is a three-dimensional form. Okay. Then I'm going to start here for the other leg. This line doesn't really represent anything. It's just an idea of the gesture that happens. You could as well use 2 lines, like so. So we go out. You can see, though, compared to that, I'm already trying to bend this a little more. Why? Because that's what happens there. And here, for the lower leg, you have 2 options. You can do this, so you can close it this way, or if you want to emphasize the fact that it's actually pivoting here and pushing weight up a little bit through the foot, you can flick it the other way. Either way is fine. In fact, it's all up to you. You can decide how you want to emphasize something. It's not written anywhere, so you have freedom. That's probably frightening for the beginner, but you don't have to follow a straight rule. So if I now indicate a bit of that hip bone, just to make the torso a little longer because it was a bit short. What I can do on the other side is just flick and flick back and then use something for the hand like that. The legs are a little long, but it doesn't really matter that much. These arms could have been longer. So now I do that. I flick it, doesn't matter where it ends. And then the other one. You see, you can kind of see that curve in the muscles here. You want to basically examine the reference for all these little nuanced curves and represent them in a more obvious manner in your gesture. So obviously we don't really have the exact width here because of the mannequin method that we used, but we can still do that and that. Now this was already pretty easy, so it's not such a big improvement, but you can still see it's fairly dynamic compared to the straight lines version. The most obvious one in any case is this. But okay, let's say you got your mannequin right. What happens if you completely screw up proportions? Well, one of the things that can happen is that you make the torso too short. If your torso is too short, like in this example from one of my students, you can see that this whole trunk part cannot bend. You can not possibly show any gesture in there. So what do? Well, pretty obviously, you make the torso longer. And ideally, you also offset that. If you push this pose more, let's say we push it forward, we feel the push forward. I don't have the reference for this on screen, but you can probably tell what the overall pose was. So if you extend it a little bit towards the right, you see that you do get more range of movement, and you can indicate that push a little more. I might have even made it a little too long here, but you see the point. Now you do have that push that you couldn't have before. So if we go back to these examples that I showed before, how would we interpret this specific pose instead of the student interpretation? First, we consider the angles. Let's consider once again the tilt of the head. We consider the neck. We consider where the shoulder is. It's pretty close there. We consider where the crotch might be. something like that. It's probably in line with the head. Let's say something like so. What's the orientation of the hips? Let's say it's something like this. Where is this leg going? Well, it starts around here, and clearly it makes an S-curve. So we go out like that. The foot is around here. There is this sort of ground plane here. I might have even exaggerated this a little bit. Go down again, consider that S-curve, and then if we now add the arms, this arm could be straight, so I'm still gonna bend it a little bit, just a little bit, so that I don't stiffen it up later eventually. And this one, once you consider this extreme angle of the shoulders, I'm probably gonna do something like that. So you see, I'm actually going through the hand and making the hand part of the gesture, because that helps to give the pose a little more flow. So if you have something like this as a starting point, it's not going to impair the whole figure. The angles are really important. The angles are going to give you those issues like the long torso and the stiff pose. And with a better gesture, we can obviously add forms on top much easier. These forms are inherently not that bad. The problem is that the gesture underneath is bad. So if we were to add something to this, we could easily, maybe with another color, choose even boxy forms that help us define the pose rather than impair it. Another common issue is that because the base gesture is stiff, you're not naturally inclined to curve those forms. So if I go over this, see, I'm trying to curve these a little bit to follow that gesture. If I were to use simple cylinders here, so if I were to do this, that would still be better than the super stiff mannequin, but not only that would be thick, which is another issue, making thick limbs definitely kills gesture and makes the figure look stiff, but you see they're not helping that much. They're okay because the mannequin is okay, but if you want to really squeeze all the gesture out of a possible pose, you would have to curve those volumes, curve them across the line. Something like this. You see now that these are curved, we didn't really lose much of that dynamism of the pose that we had initially. And this is for legs, and this is for arms as well. You're always looking for ways to curve these limbs across the gesture, even if the curve is not there yet. So something like this will be maybe interpreted as such. Now, if we go back to something like this example, and we try to apply those edits, we're going to get a way more dynamic form. So we flick that. Let's maintain the angles. Let's assume they're correct. So we consider this one as the front leg. We go down. We consider this. It's still pretty stiff as a pose, but we can do wonders by just curving the limbs. So if I curve this, making it the proper size, consider the hip bone, go back here, and I don't see the reference, but I'm probably going to do something like this. Then from here, I do that and that. I am thinking about the curve even if I don't necessarily draw it in the end. Even if this kind of feels straighter, the way I think about it, the way I am perceiving it is with a flow. Always think about the flow between forms rather than the single letters. Remember, you're not writing. Drawing is not writing. You're not trying to write a letter. You're not writing even an S. You are flicking your pen. You can do this kind of exercise actually if you want to get better at this. Just start anywhere and flick so that you get used to making more gestural forms. So we do something like that for this mannequin, and then on top we can add the volumes. Again, we keep that curve. We even maybe emphasize it more with our volumes. Because if we don't emphasize it, then the chances of making that stiff are really high. So we curve it here. We keep gesturing away and maybe fixing proportions as I go here. As we draw, so that the final result, let's see, by using even a box here, stays dynamic. See, I'm pushing this forward, even if I don't have to. How about something like so? Maybe the head is looking up. Creating this zigzag sort of action between head and torso, and ideally even the hips, gives the figure even more dynamism. Now for the arms, see, I'm curving the upper arm, I'm curving the lower arm using the correct orientations, and then I'm going to use a simple form for the hand because it doesn't really matter. So here, I'm going to start again with a curved form for the upper arm and a slightly curved form for the forearm. And that's it. And you can see now this is way more dynamic than the initial one, than the initial mannequin, just by pushing the curves a little more. So this is how you bend gestures and make them more gestural or dynamic in case your figures are stiff. Just apply these methods and I guarantee 100% that your figures are not going to be stiff anymore. But this is all I have for you today. Let me know in the comments down below if any of these things we talked about today apply to you and how you go about fixing them. As always, if you liked the video, hit that thumbs up and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.